I think those who eat a phytochemical-free diet will survive, but I think the quality of their life will suck. I think if you look at health span rather than lifespan, it's conceivable, though, that people who eat no phytochemicals, no fruit and veg, could live to whatever some reasonable old age is. But all the data says that they won't live healthy.
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Hey friends, great to be here with you. I'm your host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. In my career, I've worked with many people, including elite professional athletes, to improve their health, performance, and longevity. And I'm currently involved in research with a group of nutrition scientists in Australia, looking at dietary patterns and mental health. Today, I sit down with the great Jed Fahey, PhD. Dr. Fahey is a nutritional biochemist with an extensive background in plant and human nutrition and phytochemistry. He was an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins Medical School, where he directed the Coleman Chemoprotection Center, a leading center for the study of phytochemicals, or phytonutrients, as they're often called. In this conversation, we cover what phytochemicals are, some of the proposed ways that phytochemicals affect human physiology and health, Dr. Fahey's research interest into broccoli and sulforaphane from food versus supplements, which is better and why, glucosinolates and thyroid function, whether resveratrol is a longevity compound, and plenty more. Please do enjoy, and I'll catch you on the other side. Welcome to the show, Jed. It's a pleasure to finally have you with us.
Thank you, Simon. I very much appreciate it. I look forward to chatting with you about all things phytochemicals and anything else you want to talk about, and we'll see where we go.
Yes. So for a bit of background context for the listeners, this conversation came about following an introduction from our mutual friend, Doug Evans. And people who have been longtime listeners of the show will be familiar with him. He's the author of the Sprout book, and he's been on the show a couple of times now. So I was spending some time out at Wonder Valley Hot Springs, Doug's business outside of LA. And of course, in typical Doug fashion, he spoke to me about sprouts and the powerful nutrition that sprouts offer at almost every opportunity.
No, really?
Yeah. So that's no surprise. And sure enough, your name, the great Dr. Jed Fahey, and your work with broccoli sprouts and this wonderful compound called sulforaphane came up a number of times. And here we are today, a chance for us to connect and a chance for myself and the listeners to learn from an incredible career scientist. So, Jed, perhaps you can take us back. I know that you're a nutritional biochemist, and I know you have this passion for phytochemicals and have been studying them for decades, much of that while at Johns Hopkins. How did all of this come about?
It's a very long story. I'll spare you. Let me condense it. But I have to give a shout out to Doug Evans and say thanks, Doug. And his, I was so, I won't say gobsmacked, but I was so happy to see his book when it came out, the Sprout book, which really, has a lot of science in it, and it was just so readable and usable for the layperson who wanted to try sprouts, because as you probably are aware, I'm sure this is the case in Australia as it is here. It's difficult to get them in the supermarket, and they don't last very long. They don't ship very well. So I think Doug has done a great service to the community of people who want to eat a bit better. Mm-hmm. You asked about my background, and I told you about Doug, but I can tell you how I got there if you'd like.
No, I completely agree with you. That the book's incredible. It is very accessible, and when Doug was telling me about the power of sprouts, and of course I've seen sprouts in the grocery store for years and years, but I never really thought of them, other than anything but a small little topping and I didn't see them as the sort of nutritional powerhouse that they are. And of course, when you learn what's in them, then you have a million questions. Well, how long do I soak them for? What kind of jars do I need? And he did a great job covering all of that.
Yeah, I think he did, and I've heard some of his podcasts and that he's done with others, and so rock on, Doug. Keep going. So I got into this business because I wanted to feed the world. When I was a kid, first I wanted to do it with oyster culture because I lived near an oyster aquaculture farm. I was toying around with going to music school because I was a classical cellist, and I wound up going to college, and I was thrown in with a bunch of pre-meds, and I knew that I didn't want to do that, although in hindsight it might have been fun. But so I studied algae, microalgae, and I got a master's in algal physiology. And I got hooked up with spirulina or spirulina, which became a big health food craze. So this was back, by the way, and I went to college in the early 70s. I got gray hair. I've been around a bit, and went to graduate school. Got a master's in the late 70s. I didn't get my doctorate in human nutrition and nutritional biochemistry until I was about 50 years old at Johns Hopkins. But that's another story. So I thought I'd feed the world with spirulina. That didn't work. My first job was actually working on the Viking Mars lander project, where they were trying to simulate the data. We were trying to simulate the data from Mars to show that there was life on Mars. We didn't, by the way, or you would have heard about it, and I'd probably be wearing a different hat. And I was, of course, a technician for somebody who had invented one of the Mars lander packages, the labeled release experiment. Anyway, that was a short job, but in that job, I was able to get slightly more piped into food production and algal secondary products. And this is key to what you're asking, I guess. So I did a study for this small company I worked for where we were looking at the benefits of the stuff that algae produce other than carbohydrates and proteins and fats and fiber maybe. Anyway, and I worked for a bunch of biotech companies for about 15 years in agricultural biotechnology. My focus shifted. I thought I was going to help feed the world by making better, more productive plants that had nitrogen-fixing bacteria associated with them when they weren't born that way, as it were. Those promises, it turned out, were very long-term. A lot of those biotech, I worked for, I guess, 3 different companies, and they all had very long-term horizons and, a lot of hand-waving and promises to investors that were never really, in hindsight, that promising. And then I wound up at Johns Hopkins looking for a way out of these promise you everything biotech companies. And I don't mean to demean them or damn them, but that's sort of the way I felt at the time. And in 1993, I met up with Paul Talalay, who was a very distinguished professor of pharmacology at Johns Hopkins. And he had just discovered with his student, I should say, Yushin Zhang, sulforaphane, this molecule, which we can talk about later. It's a phytochemical. They discovered it in broccoli, tiny amount. And Paul asked if I would join him, if I would take a risk joining him, because this was sort of wacky at the time. The idea, they discovered it, I should say, because their goal was to develop food-based cancer preventive compounds. And that was it was not very popular in the scientific community back in the early 90s. Anyway, I then spent 27 years with Paul. We developed the Chemoprotection Center. I wound up directing it in the end. And we were studying the effects of phytochemicals, plant chemicals, on not just cancer prevention, but the prevention of we evolved the prevention of a whole slew of chronic diseases. We had focused on cancer. By the time I retired in 2020, in the middle of the year, the middle of a pandemic, remotely, virtually, I retired, had 3 virtual retirement parties, which are pretty freaking lame. You'd hoist a glass, but I appreciate those people who did it for me. And by the time I retired, we really had expanded our scope, and the field had expanded hugely to realize that phytochemicals from plants, which we still have to define, but I'm going to take a breath first, have huge benefit in the preventive world. I'm going to take a breath, sir.
Yeah, I mean, what a multifaceted journey. Thank you for sharing that, and congratulations on the retirement. You mentioned discovery of sulforaphane, and if I heard you correctly, I think you said 1993, and this gets me thinking about the discovery of phytochemicals in general. And I think we discovered vitamins in the early kind of 1910s, and then minerals. By the 1950s, there were daily values for things like calories and protein and various vitamins and minerals. When was it that scientists first realized that, hey, plants contain not only energy, macronutrients, vitamins and minerals, but there's also this other class of compounds that we now call phytochemicals?
That's a good question, Simon, and I'm not positive when that might have been, but I know that when I started at Johns Hopkins in 93, the word phytochemicals, or phytonutrients, they were called by some people, doesn't really matter what you call them, had been around probably since the 70s. But I think, I'll sort of have to revisit history on this to give you a really accurate answer. But I think the realization sort of accompanied this discovery of sulforaphane, and at that point in time, people already knew about curcumin from turmeric, very, very powerful and potent Indian subcontinent spice. And so people certainly knew that phytochemicals gave flavor and taste and odor or scent to plants. The idea that they were being repurposed by our bodies for protection against disease or for therapy in the Western medicine tradition is certainly, I would say, in the last 30 to 50 years. But as I know you know, because I read your excellent book, the traditional medicine traditions go back thousands of years, and the idea that plants could do these funky things like protect you against certain diseases was well established. It's just that Western physicians and Western nutritionists were pretty clueless until the 70s or 80s. We better define phytochemicals for the viewers who are just coming to this naive, shall we say. The way I define them is any of the compounds produced by plants that are not vitamins, minerals, or the macros, carbohydrates, proteins, fats, fiber. They are secondary metabolites of plants. And what that means is just that they're not the main things plants have to survive and to live, but they are protective of the plants. Plants evolved, Michael Pollan famously, I can't remember his exact quote, but he said something like the effect of plants are stuck where they can't run away, they can't fight. So they've evolved this incredible armamentarium of defensive compounds. That's what phytochemicals are. And they attract pollinators, they repel predators in some cases. They have a whole host of purposes in the plant. We repurpose some of them because they're not toxic to us. And of course, some phytochemicals like nicotine are very toxic to humans. So there's a balance. And the question of how we as humans evolved knowing that we could eat some plants and not others is pretty cool. I'd love someone to give me a good answer to that. How many people had to die trying, foxglove or nicotiana or some toxic plant? But so that's what phytochemicals are. They're present in very low quantities, milligram quantities or microgram quantities. And because of that, or as a result of just the way they evolved, many of them are very potent, either as colorants, flavorants, or scents.
So I know we're going to explore kind of how they affect our physiology, but a question has just kind of popped into my mind. So if these compounds are part of the plant's natural defense system against predation from insects and fungi and certain animals, is there a difference between organic and conventional produce and their sort of phytochemical content? Do organic foods contain more because the plant has to perhaps defend for itself more?
Yes. And is there great proof? It's getting better. 20, 30 years ago, I got into pitched battles with horticulturists at meetings and agronomists about that question. And it was poo-pooed. And there really wasn't much evidence to support what you're suggesting 20, 30 years ago. It's very clear now that, yes, there are more. It depends on what phytochemical you're asking about, of course, but there are certainly more when plants are stressed and stressed in certain ways. Cannabis produces more THC and CBD when it's up at higher elevations and gets more ultraviolet light. It's in part a protective mechanism. Broccoli appears to produce more of the precursor to sulforaphane when it's being chomped on by predators, worms and various predators. So the evidence is still, I would say, isn't as good as I'd like to see it, but it's certainly building. And when you think about what the plant has to do, it's so intuitive that what you say is true. And I hope that doesn't get in the way of a lot more really concrete proof that will shut some people up about it. So you look at an apple, you look at a perfect apple in a supermarket, maybe even wrapped in plastic. It's been bred for sweetness. We can talk about sugar if you want, but so it's been bred for sweetness, and it's been bred for pest resistance, and it's been bred for time of fruiting so that they can all be harvested at the same time. And it has not been typically bred for flavor, although obviously there are various cultivars of apples. But then you look at an organic apple, and they've got blemishes. They've got, I forgot what they're called, but blemishes, cankers, various misshapen features, because they've been stressed by bugs during their lifespan. And most people, especially the cider makers and the apple juice makers, will tell you there's tremendously more flavor in those organic or heirloom apples that don't get sprayed with pesticides, which kill every damn bug and every bacterium around them. And so they're growing in dirt instead of nurtured by soil. Anyway, I'm ranting and maybe exaggerating a little bit, but hopefully it gets the point.
No, it's super interesting. Do you have any kind of idea as to how many phytochemicals have been identified by scientists? What sort of number are we talking about here? And I guess to extend that question, when someone says to you, broadly speaking, how are phytochemicals classified? Because I think people will have heard of things like polyphenols before and perhaps know that resveratrol is a polyphenol, and hear you talking about sulforaphane. But how are these kind of broken up into different classes of phytochemicals?
Yeah. So first, the number. So my colleague and friend Tom Kensler and I did a paper that came out about a year ago called that was examining the use of phytochemicals. So it was published, and we wanted to pick a number for how many phytochemicals there are in the universe that someone else had sort of published, because we didn't want to get, because it's hard. It's a hard number to defend, frankly. And so we picked the most conservative number we could find, which was 50,000 phytochemicals. And somebody by the name of Barbassi published that in a 2020 paper in a good journal. And we said, let's pick that one. But the interesting thing is, two interesting comments I'd like to make. One is that in that paper, I, for the first time, read the characterization of phytochemicals as the dark matter of nutrition. And we used that in our paper. We copied it. I love that characterization because it is that. I mean, there are a ton of them. They act synergistically, additively, cooperatively, antagonistically, and you get certainly hundreds to thousands with every different plant you eat. The more liberal estimate comes actually and is supported by my friends at Brightseed, a biotech company out in San Francisco. And they're doing sort of metabolomics of plants. They're doing prospecting of phytochemicals, and they're using all the latest tools of artificial intelligence and the latest technology. And their estimate is that the number is more like 5 to 10 million phytochemicals in the world of plants. Now, chop that in half and say only half are from edible plants and half are from toxic plants. It's still a damn big number. People. So to your second question, or the second part of it, people it depends on who you are, how you characterize them. Chemists, phytochemists, biologists, by and large, will sort of key on the class of compound, the way the molecule is shaped. And so sulforaphane, it belongs to a class called isothiocyanates. You mentioned the polyphenols. There's certainly the hugest group of phytochemicals that are known are the flavonoids. Include isoflavones like those from soy, diazen and genistein. I think there's something like 30,000 identified flavonoids, but they are the things that give so many berries. They're rich color: blackberries, raspberries, blueberries. Blackberries and raspberries. Blueberries actually have another class of compounds called anthocyanins. But again, this is all based on chemical structure, and each of these families is large. The more sort of traditional medicine, plant healer community tends to talk about their function and classify them by function. Adaptogens, pigments, scents, SENTS, and so there are a lot of ways of categorizing them. As a nutritional biochemist, I use the chemical scheme really when I think about them and talk about them, because that keys you into what they might do molecularly, how they might act mechanistically.
And carotenoids would be another group, right?
Yeah. And
what would be the kind of most well-studied phytochemicals, if there was a handful or so? I mean, you mentioned curcumin. What would this kind of top 5 phytochemicals be, and what foods would they be found in?
I'm chuckling because in the paper I referred to that Tom Kensler and I did, which I don't know if you have show notes that you can link to. I'll have to
we'll put it in there.
That. But we actually plotted the number of citations in all the large scientific database, Scopus we used, which you can look in PubMed or anywhere else. The number of citations for each of the phytochemicals, like we ranked them highest to lowest. And then we contrasted that on the other axis to number of clinical studies, because that's what we were keying in on in this paper. And what rose to the very top was CBD. Not really a surprise, I suppose. And N-acetylcysteine, which is not directly really a phytochemical. And things like quercetin from onions and oak leaves and so on was up there. What do I think? And sulforaphane, which I spent over a quarter century studying, was, I don't know, number 40, 45 or something. So in terms of number of citations, it wasn't really high. I mean, there were many thousands, but the ones that were highest had 60, 70,000 citations.
Wow.
I'm going to do you a favor and not pull that paper up and try to multitask here and read you from the list, but that list is certainly accessible and we could read from it.
Yeah, I'll put that into the show notes. So there's, minimum there's 50,000 of these phytochemicals. Quite possibly there's up to millions of them that are available to us through our diet. I'm interested in your view on whether they are to be considered essential or not. If someone doesn't consume vitamin C and develops deficiency, they can develop scurvy. The same could be said with vitamin D and rickets, or vitamin B1 and beriberi. And we've all heard about these nutritional deficiency-related diseases, the typical kind of non-communicable diseases from early 1900s. What happens if someone eats very little plant foods and consumes very little amounts of phytochemicals?
Again, you're gonna get me pontificating and perhaps hypothesizing a little bit, but this is something which is called the Western diet, or the American diet, right? Which is very low by and large on phytochemicals, and I've got another plot somewhere that I can share with you, sort of showing over evolution over something like 10,000 generations of humankind. So the relative percentages of fat, sugar, which was essentially non-existent when we started out, protein and carbs in the diet, and phytochemicals, which we guesstimated. But phytochemical content was certainly high in the hunter-gatherer era, went down in the agriculturalist period, which has only been 10,000 years or so, because humankind focused on a very small number of plants then, and has stayed low with certainly the Western diet, because we eat so much ultra-processed food. The numbers are staggering. Something like 60 or 70% of food eaten is processed or highly processed, and those ultra-processed foods are stripped of phytochemicals, more or less. And there's a lot of hand waving and marketing about those that say they're not. There are also a lot of other things added to them, but I think you asked what I think, and do I have proof of this? Not really, not yet. But I think those who eat a phytochemical-free diet will survive, but I think the quality of their life will suck. So I think if you look at health span rather than lifespan, it's conceivable, though, that people who eat no phytochemicals, no fruit and veg, could live to whatever, some reasonable old age is. But all the data says that they won't live healthy, that they will suffer from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 concurrent chronic disease states by the time they are at the end of the road. And that's called health span. And conversely, it's been shown that people eating phytochemical rich, call them Mediterranean diets, or, as you know, there are many, many others. And it doesn't have to be, there does not have to not be any meat in those diets. And of course, it's a complex of things that's been talked about by Dan Buettner and Blue Zones and so on, stress and exercise and so on, and sleep. But those people who eat phytochemical-rich diets have much better health span and much fewer concurrent diseases. And then someday, my goal is just not to wake up someday, but damn, it was a good ride until I got there.
Mm-hmm. Quality of life.
Yeah, it's all about quality of life. I'm it's hard to do that phytochemical-free experiment in human beings, though, right? It's ethically, not an experiment you can do, and it would take the lifetime of an investigator and zillions of dollars. So it's not very straightforward. Short term, you can do it.
What about if we think about the mechanism of action, though, that may speak to how those phytochemicals are affecting health span? I mentioned vitamins and minerals before, and these vitamins and minerals are considered essential because they often act as cofactors or components of enzymes and are kind of critical for the body. If the body's not relying on phytochemicals as cofactors and components of enzymes, what pathways are they acting on? What's the kind of proposed mechanism of action that leads to these phytochemicals exerting this benefit that then reduces our risk of developing chronic disease?
So remember, pick the number 50,000 to 5 million phytochemicals. Of course, there's so many different ones and so many different categories that really I think it's very safe to assume that they probably affect all major metabolic pathways and probably all minor metabolic pathways. I would be shocked if they didn't. We know from our work that certainly these different classes of phytochemicals do act on both the same and different pathways, and so their mechanisms of action overlap. We've focused, as I said, on sulforaphane and the isothiocyanates, and for example, the mechanisms of action there include anti-angiogenesis, which is development of proliferation of blood vessels, especially important in cancer. Anti-inflammatory, which I don't think I need to say any more about. There's activity against the heat shock response, which is a protein damage reparation, sort of a pathway, among others. These are potent antioxidants and detoxification. They're potent in promoting detoxification of the cell. So to unpack that, and I should mention, I was actually just listening to a podcast by Kara Fitzgerald and Jessica Houston, and Kara was talking about all of the DNA methylation effects that phytochemicals, some of them have either been shown to have or certainly may have, incredibly important in epigenetics and imprinting. So I mentioned the antioxidant potency, for example, of sulforaphane. We have for years now called sulforaphane an indirect antioxidant. And the reason for that is that it is not a direct antioxidant like vitamin C is. Vitamin C is used up as soon as it encounters reactive oxygen, and you have to give it more. So you have to have vitamin C on board in the blood to do its thing. What happens with sulforaphane is that chemically it's not an antioxidant. I repeat, it is not. And so, but what it does is it upregulates or induces or boosts levels of a whole suite of protective enzymes that in and of themselves are antioxidant enzymes that supply the glutathione pathway. Glutathione is the body's most potent, most abundant, I should say, antioxidant. It upregulates through a regulator called the NRF2 or NRF2. It upregulates hundreds of detoxification and antioxidant enzymes, as well as a variety of anti-inflammatory responses. So, do other phytochemicals do exactly that? Yeah, they do. And for curcumin's actually an example. But there are others which don't. Things like resveratrol is potent in the mTOR pathway and phosphorylation. So you have to look at the way each of them interact. And I've spent a quarter century studying essentially one set of pathways and one set of compounds. Not that we haven't done a lot of other things too. So I can't give you a one-word answer, or I can't give you one answer, but I'd say they affect all biochemical mechanisms. But I'm sorry to drone on about this, but what that means from the perspective of health span and quality of life is that, yeah, you can live, but if you upregulate your defenses, then you're not going to develop, COPD as quickly, or you're not going to perhaps develop whatever cancer you had a big red target on your back for, maybe ever, or maybe as soon. So it's extending, or it's pushing up that quality of life that I think is what phytochemicals are all about. They're not nutrients in the classic sense of the word, we know that, and they're not vitamins or minerals in the sense that they're not cofactors for enzymes, although they do upregulate some of the enzymes that have cofactors we're familiar with.
When you say they upregulate our natural defense system in some of these pathways, like the NRF2 pathway, which then results in the production of the antioxidant glutathione.
Yeah.
Is that because these molecules, going back to what you stated earlier, are part of the plant's defense system and they're causing some micro stress within our bodies? Is that what's happening? Is that why we respond in that way?
It appears with many of them, absolutely, it appears that that's what happens. So there's been comparatively little work done on what those phytochemicals do in the plants that have them, that make them, except fighting off critters and predators. But it is known that they do upregulate or boost the activity, cause more enzyme molecules to be produced. I realize upregulate is a little wonky a word, but they cause, essentially they enter the cell, they go to the nucleus, in the case of sulforaphane, it goes into the cell, it binds to the NRF2 regulator, which then, or its chaperone, which then goes to the nucleus, gloms onto the DNA, and says to the DNA at a specific region, make more of this enzyme in this one and this one. And so the cell makes more of those enzymes. But then the sulforaphane, and this is true of many other phytochemicals, it's an exogenous compound. It's foreign. Our cells, don't want it, and they chuck it out, and it winds up back in the bloodstream, and then back filtered out and back in the urine. So we get rid of sulforaphane every bit as fast as we get rid of vitamin C. And I mean, there's data to show that we and others have developed. But the difference is, when the vitamin C goes away and you flush it down the toilet, the antioxidant ability that came with it is gone. When sulforaphane is flushed down the toilet, its effect lasts for a day or 2 or 3 days, because it has helped create more of these enzymes that are effective detoxifiers.
So other than, and we can talk about sulforaphane, because I appreciate that it may be hard to kind of answer some of these questions, broadly speaking, about all phytochemicals, given their kind of unique differences in terms of how they affect physiology. But other than upregulating the NRF2 pathway and resulting in the production of antioxidants, is there any potential for deleterious effects, on other pathways? Often I hear about this kind of biphasic mechanism of action, which I guess speaks to the importance of dose. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, certainly. And so thank you for not pushing me to talk about all 5 million phytochemicals, because I obviously can't. But Yeah, with sulforaphane, for example, we know that there may be a downside to, for example, taking it if you have a frank cancer. So if you have a tumor, I mean, when you think about what I just told you it does in terms of protecting against oxidants and oxidative stress in a, quote, healthy body, when you think about what a tumor is something that grows fast, certainly grows faster than the surrounding tissue or the surrounding cells. That's how it ultimately has its effect. Cancer does. So if sulforaphane protects a normal cell, does it also protect a rapidly growing cancer cell? And I think we still, unfortunately, although a lot of work has been done on it, we don't know enough to really be prescriptive in our recommendations, because although it certainly appears that it enables more rapid growth of cells by protecting them from oxidative stress, it also has effects on things like autophagy, which is the normal process by which your body and your organs kill off cells when they're at the end of the line. So we have a constant cycling of cells, things like the colon especially, but in almost all of the body. So the reason sulforaphane has been called a double-edged sword in terms of cancer is because there are those effects which are actually beneficial in fighting cancers. And for example, there are synergies that have been shown with a couple of cancer drugs. So they enhance the mechanism or the activity of cisplatin, which is a widely used drug, and exemestane, which is an aromatase inhibitor used in breast cancer therapy. In terms of a prescriptive approach, I would say that is a caveat. In terms of dose, I mean, it was said by Paracelsus or one of those old guys that the dose makes the poison. So you can kill yourself with too much salt or water or anything, and certainly with too much, I'm sure, of any phytochemical. There's this concept of hormesis, not to be confused with another similar word that I'm not very fond of, but the idea that at a low dose there may be benefit, at a higher dose there may be toxicity, so picking the right dose range is clearly important for all of these phytochemicals, which could lead us to a day-long conversation about supplements versus whole food or real food. And I certainly make the case, and many others do, that if you eat real food, fruits and vegetables, or meats, seafood, and so on, you're self-regulating what you're getting. People often ask me about broccoli. Well, how much broccoli do I have to eat to get enough sulforaphane? Well, when you eat too much broccoli, your body's going to say, I'm going to go throw up, or I'm stuffed, I'm just uncomfortable, I'm not going to eat anymore. And that's sort of an auto break on, I think, overconsumption of these things.
What you're speaking to is really important, because we can kind of fall into this trap of when you identify something that has a beneficial effect on physiology, that you fall into the trap of thinking more equals better. And that's not always the case. So I do want to come in a little bit to talk more about the types of foods that sulforaphane can be found in, minimum effective amount, and supplements and dosage and all of that. But before we do that, I want to kind of play devil's advocate a little bit here while we're talking about some of these pathways, like the NRF2 pathway. I do like to kind of jump outside of my echo chamber that all of us kind of fall into inevitably. And my low carb kind of carnivore-ish diet friends would probably push back here a little bit. And I've heard them talk about sulforaphane and these pathways before, and also this kind of biphasic sort of mechanism of action where these compounds could be potentially deleterious at high doses. And one thing that I've heard them say is that our body doesn't need these plant compounds to upregulate NRF2 and produce glutathione. And in fact, exercise and cold therapy and sauna will do all of this just fine without the risk of ingesting these kind of quote unquote plant toxins, as they put it. What do you think about that kind of idea?
I think that resonates with you, but I know there are rabid carnivores. In fact, I guess the other thing I'd point out, you mentioned saunas and cold therapy and exercise. Sure, evolutionarily, everybody got a lot more exercise than most modern Western cultures do now. But certainly not everybody did sauna therapy and cold therapy. And so, I mean, there are a lot of measures to which fitness enthusiasts go and bodybuilders go, and that's great for them, but it doesn't translate to society as a whole as a way to live, I think.
Has there been any studies that have looked at kind of quantifying when you consume foods that are rich in glucosinolates, which then produce sulforaphane, and the production of glutathione, and how that compares to, say, a bout of exercise or getting into an ice bath? Are these comparable in terms of the amount of antioxidants that the body would produce in response to those various forms of stress?
I don't know that there have been. I'm not aware of head-to-head studies on that on the specific question you asked, but I would venture to say that the effects are as great with sulforaphane consumption. I mean, we see effects. We see effects on a variety of disease conditions, disease states. We see effects on. When I say we, I use that term loosely. We and others. But various clinical studies showing effects on both biomarkers of the disease state, including glutathione levels or reduced to oxidized glutathione, that are statistically significant and that are elevated and impressive. And so I'm thinking of studies that I was actually involved with in diabetes, for example, in airway diseases, asthma, and diesel exhaust particle toxicity, to air pollution in China. Some studies we did, again, with my colleague Tom Kensler. And so, yes, there are studies that show positive effects of sulforaphane or broccoli sprout extract consumption or broccoli sprout consumption. How do they compare with exercise or we'd like to find that out, but and in fact, there are a couple of clinical studies I know of that are aiming to look at something like that. We have to be reductionist too, right? I mean, we have to. You can't look at everything at once, so it becomes a more and more expensive and difficult study to get funded and to pull off as you start to layer these things on. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think the answer is equivalence.
Hey friends, a quick message from one of our sponsors who make this show possible, and then we'll jump straight back into the episode. If you're familiar with my nutrition philosophy, you will know that I'm a big believer in plant-rich diets being better for people and our planet. You'll also know that I frequently draw attention to what I describe as nutrients of focus. These are nutrients that science shows plant-based eaters, whether plant predominant or exclusive, can fall short on, which can leave you feeling run down, lacking energy, experiencing brain fog, and generally just not as vital as you'd like to be. For that reason, together with a meal, a plant-based health and wellness company, I have formulated Essential 8. Essential 8 is your one-stop multi-nutrient, formulated with DHA, EPA, omega-3s from algae oil, vitamin B12, iodine, vitamin D3, iron, zinc, selenium, and calcium to perfectly complement your plant-rich diet. I personally take Essential 8 every morning with breakfast. Just 2 capsules, much easier than supplementing with these 8 key nutrients individually. What's even more convenient is I have a monthly subscription, so it turns up automatically on my doorstep and I never miss a beat. To get yours, head to theproof.com/friends. That's theproof.com/friends, where you'll find a link to purchase Essential 8 that will get you an extra 5% off your first order on top of the significant subscription discount. There will also be a link for this in the show notes. Okay, back to the show.
And I think until that evidence kind of exists, the common sense approach, or what I see as common sense approach, is not looking at this as it's one or the other, but how many of these different aspects of our life can we try and integrate and stack on top of each other. And so sulforaphane, let's dig into this a little more. And you've just mentioned there some of the science that has been conducted into this molecule. Are we talking mainly animal studies, or are these human intervention studies? If someone just said, Jed, how well established is it that sulforaphane is beneficial for humans? What are the kind of best areas of science or studies that you would point to?
So I think and again, my colleague Tom Kensler and I have a different paper that talks about, about 3 different papers in the last 3 years that talk about this. I think in terms of animal studies and cell culture studies, there are tons of them, to use a very technical term, certainly hundreds, probably thousands. In terms of clinical studies, human studies with real live human beings, there are close to 100 now that have been done. We've been involved with many of them, but certainly not all. So at least half of them are done by other groups. And so those studies have administered either the food, which is broccoli or broccoli sprouts, or the precursor, which is found in those foods when they're not damaged, and that's called glucoraphanin, or sulforaphane, which is what's ultimately produced in a plant that's chewed on by insects or that's destroyed by bacteria because it's a defensive reaction. It's also, I should mention, produced in your gut by your microbiome. So that if you ingest cooked broccoli, for example, you make sulforaphane from the precursor. Just the levels and rates vary all over the place from person to person. So of those close to 100 studies, probably 2/3 or half to 2/3 were done on healthy individuals. But the other types of disease states or conditions that were examined include diabetes, a number of different cancers, COPD, as I said, asthma and allergy, diesel exhaust particle toxicity, just volatile air pollution toxicity. We have a number of studies we did in China on that. And the outcomes, and I should say autism and schizophrenia. And I've been involved in about 7 studies on the combination of those two, both in the US and in China. And so I'd say the take home on schizophrenia is still up for debate because it's very difficult to study. It's difficult to study vis-a-vis when you intervene. With autism, it's a bit easier, although it's a very difficult clinical study to do. And Andy Zimmerman at Harvard and later at UMass Medical Center worked with us at Hopkins to do 2 clinical studies. In the first one, we showed, I would say, a fairly dramatic difference in symptoms. We didn't have any biomarkers, though. And in the second study, we showed a less robust, but still a difference in outcomes, autistic behaviors, characteristic behaviors. And we did have some biomarker data. And it's important when you do these studies to not only be able to say, especially neurological or psychiatric studies, to not only be able to say, okay, the caregivers said they got better in this and this way, or the physician treating said they got better in this and this way. But if you can do that and correlate it with biomarkers like glutathione levels or mitochondrial activity, that makes it it makes it a more powerful study, but it gives the next person wanting to do a study like that a hell of a lot more ammunition to work with to try to figure out where to go next to really plant a stake in the heart of this as a therapy. Or that's the opposite simile that I'm looking for. But yeah.
So where's the kind of consensus with currently when it comes to sulforaphane and autism? Do we understand the mechanism of action and dosage, and is it kind of accepted as something to use therapeutically, or is it in that basket of interesting and we see something and there's more research that needs to be conducted?
I think it's clearly in the basket of things that can be used clinically. I think the problem, which I'm sure you've seen in your work, I think the problem lies with the medical establishment. And doctors treat disease and use drugs and surgery. And there are many doctors I know and like and respect, and they have a tough time of it in medical school. They have a hell of a lot to cram into their brains. But one thing that's not crammed into their brains is nutrition. And that's a well-documented, almost a complete blank spot in their education. So the most physicians will do is say, eat a healthier diet, eat more fruits and vegetables, get more exercise. Bam, your 15 minutes is up, go away. So nutritional counseling is woefully lacking. But I think for those who are in integrative medicine and functional medicine, it's quite well known actually that sulforaphane is, or I should say broccoli, perhaps as a supplement, is something to be reckoned with and considered. And we have friends in Korea who are prescribing it, friends in the US who are prescribing it. In fact, it's so well known, albeit by peer-reviewed publications and word of mouth, that the Parkinson's disease community has now perked up. And there are animal studies suggesting very strongly that it may be useful in Parkinson's. And so there's somebody actually a retired chemist in France who has self-experimented with broccoli sprout extracts, broccoli seed extracts, and seen remarkable, this is an N of one anecdote, but remarkable improvement of his symptoms. And he's documented them very, very fastidiously. He then recruited 8 other friends who had Parkinson's in that very tight-knit sort of self-help or network. And they documented effects also, positive effects on the disease state, on the symptoms of the disease. And he's pushing a number of us to try to develop a more robust and sort of sanctioned trial.
Yeah.
He's actually published his work in BioRxiv, which is a repository for non-peer-reviewed papers. And it's quite interesting if you have a chance to look at it. So I got away from your question, so maybe you better steer me back.
On the autism studies, the kind of clinically effective dose that's been used in these studies, are we talking about something that is available to people through the regular consumption of broccoli from their grocery store, or were these studies using very concentrated extracts or supplements that you would be unlikely to kind of obtain through a normal diet?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I should have made that clear. There are a lot of clinical studies where it would be desirable to use the whole food, but it's difficult logistically, and unfortunately, with autism, that is a major with autism with young kids. That becomes a major hurdle. A lot of autistic kids, and I'm not an expert, I'm sort of by assimilation gained some knowledge of autism, but it's certainly not my professional calling. A lot of kids with autism have very strong feeding preference, very strong food aversions, and feeding preferences, I guess, is a way to put it. So there are few foods that they'll eat and nothing else. So there's no way we could have given them broccoli sprouts. And so for the clinical trial, the first one we did, we used a sulforaphane powder that I made. And then for the 5 or 7 follow-up studies, they all used a dietary supplement rich in sulforaphane or glucoraphanin, because we could calibrate it. We could give a specific dose. And with most of these, I guess all of these studies, we wound up giving each of the caregivers an individual pill grinder, a hand pill grinder. And so these were tablets, and they ground them up, or they emptied the contents into the kid's favorite food. In terms of dose, we were very clear that, and our ethics board wouldn't have given it approval, certainly, if we had tried to use a supra dietary dose, if we had tried to go with a really high dose. And when you think about it, that would have probably been self-defeating, because you could imagine a parent or a caregiver of a 3 or 5 year old, excuse me, in one way or another, getting more broccoli into a kid's diet, or giving them a dietary supplement at a responsible, reasonable, validated dose. It's hard to imagine them giving them 2 pounds of broccoli a day and forcing them to eat it, and that you wouldn't want that, right? Quality of life would go downhill, I think. So these were dietary doses, absolutely.
And what is that like? If we're talking a dietary dose of glucoraphanin, or kind of the sulforaphane potential of a food, can you quantify that so we kind of have some idea of a number?
Yeah. So the numbers are something in the tens of milligrams per day. Based on a 70 kilogram adult. I think our target for children was, I can't remember if it was 1 or 2.2 micromoles per kilogram body weight per day. But this is well documented, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me because there's so many studies that have been done. But again, in those papers I mentioned to you, we give the whole range of doses ever given in any clinical trials to people, and we flag whether they were effective or not, or whether they produced a desirable outcome, or whether it was null. So the other thing that's important to know is the doses we talk about are calibrated for sulforaphane to be equivalent to about what one would get in a couple of servings of broccoli, market stage broccoli a day, which is a couple of 100 grams for an adult, and something like 2 ounces of broccoli sprouts that are much richer in these compounds. So we're not talking about superhuman levels, or frankly stupid levels. So we're not talking about a drug either.
2 ounces of broccoli sprouts, is that like a kind of a handful?
Right. Yeah, a handful. A lot of times in the US anyway, they come in these clamshells with about 4 ounces, so they snap closed. So about half of one of them.
So that's one of the advantages of the broccoli sprouts, is that you can get a lot of the glucoraphanin in a kind of smaller volume, so to speak, than eating whole broccoli.
Yes, exactly. And that's why we promoted broccoli sprouts in the early 90s, when we discovered that they were so much higher in this compound. But we were careful. I mean, careful is a relative term, I suppose. But I don't think we were wrong in doing it. We were careful to equate how much is in, say, a couple of ounces of broccoli to how much is in the sort of the average of broccoli sprout, how much is in the average market stage broccoli, and not to recommend exceeding what, as my now deceased mentor used to say, what enthusiastic broccoli eaters would consume. So people at the high end of broccoli consumption from all these surveys that have been done.
So you're not recommending people have cups and cups of broccoli sprouts every day?
No. And all the evidence we have to date suggests that you don't have to eat this for sulforaphane, that you don't have to eat it every day either, that every other or even every third day is probably quite as good, because you're boosting levels of these protective enzymes and you don't have to keep boosting them. Mm-hmm. We've also shown with 3 month or so studies in China that the effect, this protective effect, isn't fatigued with long-term daily dosing.
You mentioned before myrosinase, and obviously we've been talking about glucoraphanin, and we've certainly been talking about sulforaphane. And I know you kind of spoke to this, but if someone's kind of listening to this for the first time, it is somewhat confusing because there is a precursor, there's an enzyme, and then there's the active. And I know that you often talk about things like chopping and mustard seed powder. Can you perhaps just remind us again about the kind of relationship between the precursor, the enzyme, and sulforaphane, and some of these general tips that people perhaps speak about, which just helps increase the amount of sulforaphane that ultimately your body has access to?
Yeah. So in the plant, remember, the plant's trying to defend itself from various stresses. So in the plant, there's a bag of sap. It's called a vacuole, a little different than in a human being. And in that bag of juice, it's got glucoraphanin. And in the jelly part of the cell, the cytoplasm associated with membranes, it's got this enzyme called myrosinase. And it's only when you bust the cell, when you break it by chewing it or penetrating it with a fungal Hostoria or whatever it's called. It's only when you do that you let the enzyme and its substrate come together. But when you do, you form sulforaphane in the case of glucoraphanin very, very quickly within a half a minute or so, if you do it in sort of a controlled environment. And so the problem is that sulforaphane is very unstable because it wants to bind to every protein and macromolecule it sees. So it doesn't last in its active state very long, which is why in most of our trials we did deliver the precursor glucoraphanin, which is very stable. And we relied either on co-administered myrosinase, the enzyme, or we relied on the gut microflora to do the hydrolysis, to do the conversion to sulforaphane. If you've heard any of my talks, I'm sure you've heard me give this example. But the best way to sort of visualize it is with a slice of radish, with a red radish, you put it in your mouth, you chew it. The immediate sensation is cool and crunchy, but within a half minute or less, you get the heat. And what you're doing is exactly that same reaction with just a very different, very similar pair of compounds. It's almost identical to sulforaphane, but it happens to be hotter. Mm-hmm. So that's what happens when you move from the plant world. Well, let's stay in plants, not go to supplements. But if you eat raw broccoli, what you're doing is you're being the predator. So you're eating the glucosinolate or glucoraphanin, and you're creating that reaction in your mouth. And as it goes down the old pipes, your sulforaphane is being absorbed certainly more quickly than it would be if you had to wait till you got to the large intestine, mm-hmm. where you hit all of these bacteria that have myrosinase activity. So the pharmacokinetics or the dynamics of absorption are different when you eat raw broccoli than when you eat cooked broccoli. And it turns out that bioavailability is indeed higher if you eat raw broccoli, but it's not essential that you do that if you don't like it. I mean, a lot of people, a lot of talking heads and podcasters want to give recommendations, or you've got to eat your broccoli raw, or you've got to add some other source of myrosinase like mustard seed. Yeah, you can, but when you and I, who know how badly off the world is, look at the population, especially in the West, and say, what's the best thing to recommend? Are you going to give some formula about microwaving and adding mustard seed, or are you going to say, just eat more plants, damn it? Yeah, I mean, that's what you need to do to be healthier.
Yeah.
And if you want to throw broccoli or some other cruciferous vegetable in there, that's a great idea. Do it. And that's simple advice, but that's where I always turn to.
I think that's really interesting. And the point that you made there about raw versus cooked, the reason why you were talking to that is because when you cook it, you deactivate, if I'm right, that myrosinase that's in the plant, which means that reaction doesn't take place in the initial part of digestion. But I didn't know that our bacteria also has myrosinase. So there's almost a bit of a backup plan should you be consuming broccoli or cruciferous vegetables that are cooked. So that's really cool. I wonder, have you given any thought as to whether one's microbiome composition dictates their kind of ability to actually make the most of the glucoraphanin containing foods that they consume?
Yeah. Yes, we've given a lot of thought, and we're not the only ones. So one of our early experiments, we actually gave subjects, volunteers, a large dose of pre-surgical antibiotics to knock down their bacterial population, and then they self-administered fleet enemas. So they were cleaned out and had very little bacteria in the colon for the day in which we did an intervention. And we did a before and after evaluation of whether they had myrosinase activity in their microflora. And so we completely got rid of it. And then it bounced back to levels characteristic of each individual within, I think it was a month was our follow-up period. We know that all of these phytochemicals have an effect on the microbiome. And I use that term very loosely because I'm too old to be a microbiome expert. Those people are all the new breed of biologists. But we know the specific strains or species of bacteria that have myrosinase activity. And there are companies, there's a company in Japan that I know has looked at, there are multiple companies that have looked at, for example, a probiotic approach to supplying myrosinase containing bacteria by, when you think about it, well, maybe you don't want to think about it, but all you have to do is enrich a stool culture of someone's, and this is actually done for fecal transplants, which are now pretty widely used to fight certain bacterial infections. So you can select from normal human bacterial populations and sort of bump up the levels, or even select for certain types of bacteria. Can you administer them? Is it wise? Do those levels maintain themselves over time unless you have the repeat sales of buying probiotics all the time? Don't know. And so I'm not recommending that, just to be clear, but I think all this is coming, whether I like it or not. I think people will do it.
Yeah, it's an interesting area of research, and the reason that question sort of came to mind was I know that there's been research on isoflavones and some difference between people in terms of how they metabolize those based on their microbiome consumption. So it's an interesting thing to entertain, and probably an area of science to kind of watch as it unfolds. Another question I have for you is...
I just want to interrupt you and say that we actually have a study. It was a study on autism with a collaborator, and she did collect stool samples, and they were evaluated. And that paper is in my list of things to write in retirement. But so, yeah, those sort of questions are being asked. probably not fast enough.
Keeping yourself busy in retirement. So I'm not sure if that's retirement, but
well, it's just not getting a paycheck from Johns Hopkins anymore.
The glucoraphanin you mentioned is stable, and so it sort of makes sense that that's the way that the compound is in the plant, and it's not sort of activated and turned into this more unstable sulforaphane until there is some sort of predation, I guess, or threat. Right. I'm interested. How important is how fresh our food is? So is the glucoraphanin content of, say, broccoli, or broccoli sprouts, is that highest, immediately after harvesting, the fresher the plant, the sort of more sulforaphane potential? Has anyone looked at that?
Yeah. It's been looked at sort of from the side. So what we know is that as plants, stay on the supermarket shelf or in storage and age, cellular structure breaks down of the plants, and obviously not too fast, because no one would eat a broccoli if it was dried up and looked awful. But so there's some cell lysis or deterioration, and that's going to cause myrosinase to act on glucoraphanin, sulforaphane to be formed. The sulforaphane will get bound up by proteins and macromolecules in the plant, so you'll have less of the total package. And of course there are a lot of other vitamins. I shouldn't say a lot. There are other vitamins like vitamin C whose content goes down. So the loss of phytochemicals certainly parallels just general quality decline. Mm-hmm. If you look at stuff like the carotenoids, which you mentioned, same thing. Color vibrancy goes down. That means some of the carotenoids have been depleted. So yeah.
I know that's why Doug's such a big fan of sprouts, because he talks about them being literally the freshest food that you can consume. They're alive when you eat them.
But the other thing about sprouts, and having tried to push broccoli sprouts early in my career, I think I have rights to talk about this a little bit. But the thing about sprouts is they're so transplantable anywhere. I mean, anybody could grow their own food. You don't have to grow all of it and just eat sprouts, as I think Doug does. But you can add fresh sprouts, meaning fresh vegetables, mm-hmm. to your diet, no matter where you live, and it's fairly simple to do. It's effortless, let's say, but takes a little forethought.
I agree. I know that Doug does not just eat sprouts, because I saw him eating a durian, and I know he loves his durian. So
I know. And he makes wraps with nori, and yeah.
But sprouts certainly make up a lot of his calories. Talk to me about the supplements. We've kind of spoken a little bit about them. I'm interested. There are a lot of sulforaphane supplements on the market. What are your thoughts about supplements? When would these perhaps be good for someone to think about consuming versus foods? And if someone is looking at getting a supplement, is there a way of kind of negotiating all the different options out there and finding one that is of high quality?
Yeah. So I think, in full disclosure, I should say, I am consulting now for both a food company and a supplement company. By food company, I mean a responsible food company, not big food. I think there are a lot of opportunities or instances where supplementation is either wise or certainly not something to shy away from. What I always used to say is that, as we age, and I have some additions to this, but as we age, by and large, people in Western societies anyway, get less physical exercise, they get less active, and they consume less food. They don't eat as much, and it is difficult to consume, whatever the latest recommendations may be. five or 10 or, however many servings of fruit and veg a day. And it's more difficult for people faced with this constant barrage of ultra processed food, which makes up the center of, the majority of most grocery stores in this country. So you can take the attitude of, these people are wrong. They should be eating more fruit and veg, damn it. And, do it. Listen to me or else you're doomed. Well, that's sort of stupid. I used to think that sort of preaching was what I was put in my academic situation to do. But I quickly realized that, if you're talking to a brick wall and people look at you with a blank face and blank stare and go back to eating French fries and hamburgers, it's a useless battle in some cases. I'm not a legislator, political regulator type person, but they're solutions people have put forward in that realm. But so I think if someone refuses to eat more fruit and veg, then a supplement that's rich in phytochemicals or certain phytochemicals is valuable, including sulforaphane. I think what's becoming very clear nowadays is that there are many disease states for which sulforaphane supplementation may be beneficial, and nobody's in it. So first of all, nobody's in a position in the supplement world to make claims about that. And the big pharma has an absolute stranglehold on those sorts of claims. I don't want to see sulforaphane turned into a drug because it's not. It's a natural product. It's a plant compound. Yet people are constantly trying to make derivatives that are more potent or less, or that they can patent. So I think in many of these disease states, there is becoming, I mentioned the autism and Parkinson situation, a groundswell of interest in these things. And in many cases, supplementation would be reasonable. If you go to this whole issue of chronic diseases, and you look at the number of chronic diseases that, for example, NRF2 upregulation is effective in, you realize that probably half of the population in this country has one of the chronic diseases that would benefit from such boosting of NRF2-related detoxification enzymes. Because I mentioned diabetes, obesity, and on and on and on. So really, you could view all of those people as candidates for supplementation, even regardless of the diets that they chose to eat.
And you mentioned before some of the doses in the studies, but I'm curious, is that what brands are using to kind of inform their own dosages? If I'm walking into the supplement store tomorrow and I want to buy a sulforaphane supplement because, let's say, for example, I just don't like broccoli. I'm telling fibs because I do love broccoli. But if I didn't like broccoli and maybe I travel a lot, I know my diet's not great, I want to get a sulforaphane supplement, and I look at all the options out there, what am I looking for to kind of separate something that might be inferior quality to something that is trustworthy and is actually going to give me the benefit that these studies have shown?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I get the impression just from what I see of the supplement industry that there's, I won't call it price fixing, but, all the supplements seem to cost about the same per bottle of 30 or 60 tablets. I think the more responsible supplement companies, which also equates to the larger ones and the more well-known ones, do a pretty good job of going a little bit on the conservative side of the dosages that would be prescribed if you followed took a mean of all the published literature, and which is difficult to do. And usually that winds up being, as I say, something like 30 to 50 milligrams a day, but you can't really equate because of the difference between glucoraphanin and the addition of myrosinase or not, and sulforaphane or not, and because there's so much incorrect labeling and incorrect analyticals in the industry, you do have to be very careful. I mentioned that I consult for a supplement company and a few food companies. The supplement company I consult for is the one that I co-founded with Paul Talley, my mentor, back in the 90s. It's been around for 25 years, and we have ceased. We ceased for a long time any involvement, financial or management, in the company because we wanted to be at Hopkins and do the clinical studies we were doing. Since I retired, I decided to go back and consult for them as a paid consultant. And I'm mentioning that not as a commercial, and you can cut this out if you want, but of the podcast, but because of my involvement with them, I know a bit about all of the supplements in the industry, the ones that sell glucoraphanin. And I can tell, and I also know that this company, Brassica Protection Products, makes a high quality glucoraphanin supplement that it sells to a lot of the bigger supplement companies and the better ones. And because I've been advising them and looking at the analyticals, I know which companies, and I won't out the bad ones here, although I've been tempted to do it on my website. There are many companies that make claims that are absurd about what claims that they have sulforaphane in their products or how much they have. So I know, and BPP does supply the ingredient. I know that, for example, Thorne has a product that I trust and that we've actually used in the clinic. It's called Crucera SGS, I believe. A company called Zymogen has one too. I've used less, but we've also used it in clinicals. A company called Nutramax has something called Avmacol, and we've actually used that a fair amount in the autism clinical studies. And all of them, I think, are very responsible, and they give you what they say they give you, and their labeled dose recommendations are reasonable. I think with all of them, it's 2 tablets a day or 2 capsules a day. But again, that sort of up translates to whatever else they have in those products, and whether they're delivering glucoraphanin plus myrosinase, or if they say they deliver sulforaphane. None of those 3 companies deliver sulforaphane. There are a few companies in the US and in Europe, and I'm not sure about, I think Australia maybe too, that claim to deliver sulforaphane. All of them that I've looked at are not true, not accurate, not accurately represented. And because it's so unstable and doesn't last, I wouldn't recommend taking it, given what I know about the products that are out there.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. There's a few options there for people to look up. One thing that just came to mind, I've had people ask me a number of times over the years about glucosinolates and thyroid health. Has there been any research looking into consumption of broccoli sprouts, for example, at the levels that you're talking about, a couple of ounces, or these supplements, and how they may affect thyroid function? And is there anything for people to be concerned about there?
I would say there's nothing for people to be concerned about there. We've looked at thyroid function in almost all the clinical studies we've done where we've done clinical chemistries, which means most of them. There's that sort of groundswell of concern has always been there because a long time ago, rapeseed, which has been bred and called canola now, produced signs of toxicity. Signs of goiter or toxicities in cattle, I believe, and off flavor in milk in cattle. And it was blamed on glucosinolates. And indeed, in the whole plants of broccoli, there are things called indole glucosinolates, which produce compounds that ultimately, and nitriles, which produce compounds that can have goiterogenic properties if you eat them in really large quantities. And there were some ancient studies from the 1920s on deliberately giving rabbits goiter by feeding them, which is iodine related, of course, thyroid, by feeding them cabbage, but it was a diet that was, I forgot, 50% cabbage or all cabbage or something. So I'd say no, there's not a concern there. In fact, there's a paper specifically based on our extensive data in China. I'm not a co-author, but Chartum Pekas is the name of the first author. And he's a thyroid expert and looked specifically at that. And the answer is no, there's no effect.
Okay, that's good to know. You mentioned Resveratrol earlier. I'm interested in what your take is on this compound, because I feel like there's been a lot of different opinions out there in the media. And in some ways, I think Resveratrol has almost left a bad taste in people's mouths about phytochemicals. I've heard people on one side of the fence claiming it's a longevity compound that will certainly add years to your life. And then there's other scientists saying that's nonsense and the data is flawed. And it seems like all of these folks are very well-established scientists, and it's a bit of a mess. I'm wondering if you have a view on this as an expert in phytochemicals, but maybe sitting a little bit outside of the Resveratrol research. Why do you think there are these very different opinions about whether this compound kind of lives up to the claims that exist?
So first of all, I'm not an expert on Resveratrol, but you mentioned that. Did you ever have David Sinclair on your podcast?
So yeah. I've had David Sinclair on, and he talks a lot about Resveratrol. Yeah. And then I've also connected, and it's been more offline at this stage, with Dr. Charles Brenner, who has a very different opinion. And not to say that they're the only two scientists out there with opinions on Resveratrol, but they're certainly both quite vocal. And from the outside, it does seem like a bit of a mess.
Yeah. I'm sure that's a good. I'm sure that's an accurate statement, but I know a lot of the early hype was based on longevity because of its involvement in the sirtuin pathway, and there may be something to that. I'm really not. I'm so distant enough from that literature not to want to venture an opinion. But I think more recently, the sort of in industry and in food technology and formulation technology, there's been a huge amount of interest in formulations, so nanoencapsulation and various liposome, phytosome encapsulations of resveratrol and curcumin also. And the reason with both of those compounds is because neither of them are that bioavailable, and you have to give a lot, and they're not very water soluble at all. So with curcumin, I think it's not a problem if you like Indian food, you just pour it on, and some of it'll get in. But I know the supplement companies have gone to great extents fighting with each other to make better formulations that are more soluble and are taken up better. I think the same goes for resveratrol. The early in the resveratrol days, I am sure you and Sinclair must have talked about this. People were saying you would need to drink 400 glasses of red wine, which is a good source of resveratrol, to get a daily dose to be effective. And obviously that's a little excessive.
Just.
Yeah. So resveratrol, much more than curcumin, in my mind, sort of gets pushed closer to the pharmaceutical realm because practical food-based doses seem a little hard to come by. As far as its effects, we know that there is a lot of mechanistic work showing its efficacy in regulating certain pathways. As I say, I'm just not savvy enough on the latest to say, is it worth trying? I don't take it, but
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. I just wanted to hear your view, but thank you for that.
Well, I agree. It's a bit of a mess.
Yeah.
But it may turn out to be the brass ring for longevity or health span ultimately, but it's not there now. Yeah.
We'll see. And I guess that kind of brings me to one of the final questions I wanted to ask you, which is looking forward, the sort of future of science that is looking at phytochemicals, resveratrol and others, sulforaphane. Are there further technological advancements that are needed, or is it just concentrating on a particular type of science that you think is required and will be beneficial in terms of pushing this area of science forward?
Well, I think one thing that will be very powerful is linking mechanisms, the molecular biology, the pathways that are well studied and well understood, with the observed symptom expression of in various disease states. That doesn't really speak to prevention that much, though, and prevention is where I really see the brass ring for phytochemicals, as opposed to therapy. So I think one really has to study mechanisms, and those are getting more and more related to risk for a variety of diseases and conditions. It's very difficult. Studying phytochemicals and their effects is extremely difficult, not because it's rocket science, but because it's very difficult to get funding for it. There's typically no intellectual property. So a pharmaceutical company, which funds all these drug trials, isn't going to step in and be a white knight and fund a $1 million intervention with something they would not have any bragging rights on, if you will. That makes it difficult. The fact that there are 50,000 to 5 million different compounds makes it really difficult. The fact that any one plant, edible plant, has hundreds, if not thousands, of bioactive compounds in it makes it difficult. The length of time, and I'm giving you all the negatives, but let's lay the cards out as they are. I think it's extraordinarily difficult, and Paul Talley and I used to talk about this a lot, to conduct a cancer prevention trial, because if you believe what many of us are saying, that you should from childhood be eating a healthy diet, such and such, then that will reduce your risk of getting cancer, which normally develops in your 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. It would literally would take the lifetimes of probably multiple generations of investigators, and it would take hundreds of millions of dollars. That's been stated many, many ways, many times before, to do a proper prevention study. So you wind up looking at populations at high risk for certain diseases, and you can do that with some cancers also. It's still a huge study. Or you focus on chronic conditions that are easier to make an early call on, and perhaps autism is one of them. Perhaps, you could argue that Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are, because generally when they develop, but maybe not, because what if your epigenetics as a fetus or as an infant, or your diet from age 5 on was really what predisposed you to some of these conditions? How the hell do you study that except in a poor mouse, which doesn't translate?
That's what I always think about the studies that look at risk populations in terms of extrapolating from that. It does leave that question of, well, whatever the intervention was it too late? Had they already lived 50 years with exposure to a diet that was low in phytochemicals, all of a sudden you run this intervention. Sure, they don't have disease yet, but you run this intervention for 5-10 years and they're developing cancer. But is that because, these phytochemicals simply turned up with not enough time to exert the benefits that they can exert over a lifetime?
Exactly. I mean, that's absolutely the concern. So, I mean, there are a lot of reasons why it's difficult to do these experiments. The light at the end of the tunnel, or the bright spot, I think there are a couple of them. One is that we as scientists, not me anymore, but the younger generation has gotten so good at doing these additive, multiplicative, combinatorial experiments where they look at more than one compound at a time, and not necessarily in the clinic, but that's coming. Because it used to be that the only way we could make conclusions about phytochemicals or about, the effects of foods is to look at a specific phytochemical like sulforaphane or resveratrol or whatever. We didn't have the tools in the lab or in our studies to look at more than one at once. And now we are. And I mentioned Brightseed in San Francisco. They, for example, are really leading the pack, I think, in looking at artificial intelligence and just this wide, unfocused, or I guess it's called non-focused metabolomics, looking at all the small molecule phytochemicals in a specific plant and mapping them, and then putting them through bioassays for efficacy or for biochemical or molecular effects. And I think that's going to lead to some eureka moments. I think it already has for them, actually. But so yeah, I mean, there's progress that's going to be made, but it's different than business has been as usual. Yeah,
sure. Well, Jed, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Consider this an open conversation. I'm so glad that Doug introduced us, and I've really loved chatting with you today. Please come back whenever you want to. To close this one out, is there anything that you feel like we missed, or anything that you would like to leave people with when it comes to thinking about phytochemicals in their diet?
No, except what we've already said, that the smart money is on just eating a healthier diet. And that's not rocket science. We do know what that entails, and we can fight about pescatarian and carnivorous and so on, and get more exercise and maintain social interactions. And I think the Blue Zone's got it right. And it doesn't matter where you live; you can practice some of these techniques, and it doesn't matter what your diet is really. There are ways to tweak all of them to make them more sensible.
Beautifully put. If folks listening would like to follow your work or connect with you online, get in touch, where's the best place for them to find you?
JedFahey.com, JedFahey.com.
Super simple.
Yeah. Yep.
Awesome. Well, I'll put that into the show notes along with lots of the studies that you've spoken about and those 2 or 3 supplement brands. Thank you so much. And yes, I really appreciate your time and hope we can do this again soon.
My great pleasure. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.